Some people mistake silence for weakness, until the day someone quietly decides they won't let the world speak over another human being. On the last Thursday of October, rain settled over Columbus like a gray blanket that refused to lift. The sidewalks shimmered beneath the morning traffic, and every windshield reflected the pale light of a sky that couldn't decide whether to storm or simply stay heavy. Grant Holloway parked his aging pickup 1 block away from Maple and Stone Coffee because the lot was already full. He reached across the passenger seat and smiled at his 10-year-old daughter. "Backpack?" Sophie held it up without looking away from the notebook balanced on her knees. "And your lunch?" She tapped the paper bag beside her. Grant laughed quietly. "You always make me ask. You always forget to trust me," she replied, closing the notebook. He stepped out into the cold drizzle first before opening her door. She slipped her small hand into his without thinking. It was something she had done since she was 4, and Grant never mentioned the day she might stop. Inside, the coffee shop buzzed with conversations, steaming milk, clinking cups, and impatient customers trying to outrun the weather. The line stretched almost to the entrance. Grant ordered a black coffee and a hot chocolate while Sophie wandered toward the pastry display, studying cinnamon rolls as if she were comparing museum exhibits. Everything felt ordinary. Until a sharp voice cut through the room. "I was saving that table." Nearly every conversation paused. Near the front window, a woman wearing a charcoal gray wool coat remained seated with both hands wrapped around an untouched paper cup. Across from her stood a man in his early 30s holding a phone inches from her face. "You heard me," he said louder, making sure his live stream captured every word. "People like you think you can ignore everyone else." The woman didn't answer. She simply looked at the phone, then toward the entrance, as though calculating the quickest way out without making the scene worse. Grant noticed something most people didn't. Her fingers were trembling. Not dramatically. Just enough for the lid of her coffee cup to rattle once against the rim. The man laughed toward his audience. "Look at that. She won't even apologize." Several customers watched. No one moved. Some smiled awkwardly. Others pretended to check messages that suddenly seemed very important. Grant handed Sophie's hot chocolate to her. "Stay right here." She nodded. Without raising his voice, he walked toward the window and stopped between the phone and the woman. The live stream now showed the back of his faded brown work jacket instead of her face. "You mind?" the man snapped. "I do," Grant answered evenly. "You blocking my camera?" "I'm blocking someone who already said she doesn't want to be filmed." "You know her?" "No." "Then stay out of it." Grant glanced at the empty chair across from the woman. "I don't have to know someone to know when they're asking to be left alone." The man scoffed. "She stole my table." Grant looked around. "I don't see a reserved sign." "I was standing here." "Were you sitting here?" The man hesitated. "No." Grant nodded once. Then asked the manager to check the security cameras. The room became strangely quiet. Not because Grant sounded intimidating. Because he sounded reasonable. The live stream comments began scrolling faster than the man could read them. His confidence slipped almost as quickly. A barista finally stepped forward. "Sir," she said carefully, "if there's a dispute, we can review the footage." The man glanced at the screen in his hand, frowned, and lowered the phone. "This place isn't worth it anyway." He shoved the device into his pocket before pushing past Grant and disappearing into the rain. The silence he left behind felt heavier than the argument itself. Grant turned toward the woman. "You okay?" She took a slow breath before answering. "I am now." He offered a small smile. "You didn't need someone to speak for you." She looked at him with quiet confusion. "You just needed the room to stop speaking over you." For the first time that morning, she smiled. It wasn't dramatic. Just genuine enough to soften the exhaustion in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Grant shrugged lightly. "I hope the coffee's still warm." He picked up his own cup, called Sophie with a nod, and headed for the door. Outside, the rain had become steadier. Grant never looked back. He never saw the black SUV waiting across the street. He never noticed the woman reaching into her coat as her phone vibrated. And he had absolutely no idea that the caller on the other end had just asked, "Ms. Whitmore, the board is waiting. Are you still coming to approve the North Bank project?" The people who carry the heaviest responsibilities are rarely the ones who complain the loudest. By 7:30, Grant Holloway had already forgotten the woman from the coffee shop. Not because she hadn't mattered. Because life had trained him to move from one responsibility to the next before he had time to think about the last one. His work truck rolled through the gates of the Columbus Municipal Transit Maintenance Center just as the morning shift changed. Rows of electric buses rested beneath enormous steel canopies, their charging ports glowing faintly against the gray October sky. The smell of wet pavement mixed with machine oil. Grant preferred that smell to expensive cologne. Machines usually told the truth. People sometimes didn't. "Morning, Holloway." His supervisor, Rick Lawson, tossed him a digital work tablet. "Bus 214 threw another battery warning. Drivers say it cuts power climbing hills." Grant nodded. "I'll start there. No coffee first?" "I already had one." Rick grinned. "You and your routines." Grant smiled politely before walking toward Bay 4. He slid underneath the bus with a flashlight, listening before touching anything. Most younger mechanics reached for diagnostic software immediately. Grant listened. Small sounds mattered. Loose bolts had their own language. Electrical failures did too. 20 minutes later he climbed back out, wiping grease from his hands with a faded shop towel. "It isn't the battery," he called. Rick looked up. "No?" Grant pointed toward a cable running beneath the chassis. "Connector housing." "You sure?" Grant simply handed him the damaged part. The cracked seal was barely visible. Rainwater had found it anyway. Rick shook his head. "I swear you hear problems before the computers do." Grant shrugged. The computers only know what somebody told them to measure. By noon, 3 buses had returned to service. Another mechanic leaned against the toolbox beside him. "You know they're opening another supervisor position next month." Grant kept tightening a bolt. "I heard." "You gonna apply this time?" "No. You'd make more money." "I know. Better hours." Grant finally looked up. "Not for me." The supervisor's schedule rotated evenings twice a week. Twice a week meant Sophie would eat dinner without him. That calculation was enough. Money solved many problems. Missing your daughter while she quietly grew up wasn't one of them. When the shift ended, Grant drove across town instead of heading home. The old brick building on Riverside Avenue looked forgotten from the outside. Inside, it was anything but forgotten. Children painted. Teenagers repaired bicycles. Retired welders taught woodworking. Parents waited over coffee while finishing paperwork after long shifts. The faded sign still read, "Riverside Workshop." Years ago, the building had been part of the city's electric streetcar depot. Now it held something far more valuable. Time. Time for children whose parents worked late. Time for neighbors who couldn't afford expensive after-school programs. Time for people who still believed communities weren't built by algorithms. Grant found Sophie sitting cross-legged on the floor with colored pencils spread around her. She wasn't drawing people. She was drawing streets. Again. Every road connected to another. Every bus stop had tiny handwritten numbers. Every park had carefully shaded trees. "You added the bridge," Grant said. She smiled without looking up. "It closes every Tuesday after lunch." "You remembered." "I remember because you always take Maple Street instead." Grant crouched beside her. The route curved across the page with surprising accuracy. Then he noticed something else. Right in the center of her drawing sat Riverside Workshop. Not the biggest building. Just the one everything else seemed to connect around. "Why'd you put this in the middle?" he asked. Sophie considered the question. "Because everyone ends up here eventually." Grant looked at the drawing a little longer than he expected. On the drive home, he placed it carefully inside a cardboard folder instead of letting it wrinkle on the seat. Some drawings belonged on refrigerators. Others deserved to survive a little longer. As traffic slowed near the North Bank district, Grant noticed fresh survey flags planted beside several abandoned warehouses. Bulldozers waited behind temporary fencing. A new banner stretched across the construction entrance. Coming soon. North Bank Renewal Project. He drove past without stopping. He had seen enough promises printed on banners to know they always looked cleaner than the neighborhoods they replaced. Power has a strange habit of making people believe they understand a city they no longer walk through. Less than an hour after Grant Holloway drove away from Maple and Stone, the black SUV carrying Audrey Whitmore crossed the Scioto River and disappeared beneath the mirrored towers of Whitmore Urban Systems Regional Headquarters. The lobby was silent. Not because it was empty. Because everyone lowered their voices when she entered. A receptionist stood. An assistant hurried forward with a leather portfolio. "The board has been waiting, Ms. Whitmore." Audrey nodded once. "No calls unless it's urgent. The New York office has already asked twice. They can ask a third time." She continued toward the executive conference room without breaking stride. The woman who had quietly accepted a cup of coffee an hour earlier had disappeared. In her place stood the founder and chief executive of one of the largest urban redevelopment companies in the country. The boardroom overlooked nearly half the city. Glass walls. Steel beams. Digital maps stretched across 3 enormous screens. On the central display glowed the words, North Bank Renewal Project. Estimated investment, $842 million. 22 executives turned toward Audrey as she entered. No one applauded. Meetings that mattered never began with applause. Malcolm Voss stood beside the presentation screen. At 52, he had spent almost 3 decades transforming abandoned industrial districts into profitable neighborhoods. He believed in numbers. He trusted schedules. He disliked surprises. "We're ready to proceed," he said. Audrey took her seat. "Let's begin." The lights dimmed. Slides shifted one after another. Projected job creation. Transit expansion. Green infrastructure. Affordable housing percentages. Private investment forecasts. Every chart climbed upward. Every graph suggested certainty. Malcolm spoke with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed every objection before anyone could raise it. "Construction begins in 6 weeks." He changed slides. "Phase 1 replaces unused warehouse properties." Another slide. "Phase 2 expands commercial space." Another. "Transit improvements reduce average commute times by 18%. The room remained quiet. Executives typed notes. Investors watched remotely through secure video feeds. Audrey listened without interrupting. Until one photograph appeared. An old brick building. Riverside Workshop. "What happens to that property?" she asked. Malcolm clicked once. "It'll be removed during Phase 2. "And the programs inside?" "We've budgeted relocation assistance." "Where?" "There are several options under review." Audrey didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the building on the screen. She remembered colored pencils scattered across a wooden floor. A little girl carefully drawing bus routes. A father kneeling beside her instead of checking his phone. The memory arrived unexpectedly. Not because it was dramatic. Because it had been ordinary. She looked back at Malcolm. "How many children use Riverside each week?" He glanced at another executive. "Approximately 60. "Approximately?" "The exact number fluctuates." "How was it measured?" "Monthly attendance reports." Audrey folded her hands. "And daily use?" Malcolm paused. "We focused on certified enrollment. Not daily traffic. Not families waiting after work. Not grandparents collecting children before evening shifts. Enrollment. A different number. A cleaner number." The meeting continued. Financial projections. Environmental reviews. Construction timelines. Every answer sounded complete. Yet something remained unfinished. Near the end of the presentation, Malcolm placed a thick binder in front of Audrey. The final Impact assessment. She opened it. Hundreds of pages. Charts. Engineering studies. Traffic models. Community summaries. Everything looked professionally prepared. Too professionally. She closed the binder. I'd like the raw transit data. The room grew noticeably still. One board member adjusted his glasses. The summary contains everything relevant. I didn't ask for the summary. Malcolm kept his voice calm. The raw files are extensive. I have time. They'll delay tomorrow's approval. Audrey met his eyes. Then tomorrow can wait. Silence settled over the room. Not hostile. Just unexpected. As the meeting adjourned, her assistant approached quietly. There's one more thing. She handed Audrey a tablet displaying a local news alert. Community group organizes against North Bank redevelopment. The accompanying photograph showed a familiar face standing outside Riverside Workshop. Grant Holloway. Audrey stared at the image a moment longer than she intended. The man who had stepped between a stranger and a camera that morning had no idea he was now standing between her company and the largest project of the year. The truth rarely arrives with a dramatic entrance. More often, it walks quietly into a room where everyone believes they already know it. 5 days later, folding chairs filled the gymnasium of the old Riverside Workshop. Parents stood along the walls. Retirees leaned against wooden support beams. Teenagers clustered near the back, pretending not to care while listening to every word. A large poster rested on an easel near the stage. North Bank Renewal Community Information Session. Grant arrived straight from work, still wearing his Navy Transit maintenance jacket. A faint streak of grease remained on one sleeve despite his attempt to wipe it away. Sophie carried the cardboard folder holding her city map. You really think they'll listen? She asked. Grant smiled. They're supposed to. She looked toward the growing crowd. And if they don't? Then we keep speaking. The meeting began precisely at 6. A city planning official welcomed everyone before introducing representatives from Whitmore Urban Systems. Several executives walked onto the stage. Then the room fell unexpectedly silent. Grant recognized the woman immediately. The charcoal gray coat had been replaced by a tailored navy suit. Her hair was pinned neatly behind her shoulders. There was no paper coffee cup. No trembling hands. No uncertainty. Good evening. Audrey Whitmore began calmly. Thank you for taking the time to be here. Whispers spread across the audience. Grant stared for a moment longer than he intended. The woman from the coffee shop. The stranger he had defended. She was standing beneath a projection screen displaying the Whitmore Urban Systems logo. The billionaire. The chief executive. She continued speaking with quiet confidence. Our goal is to transform abandoned industrial property into neighborhoods that create opportunity for future generations. Slides appeared behind her. Parks. Housing. Transit routes. Restaurants. Walking trails. Everything looked clean. Orderly. Hopeful. Grant listened carefully. She never exaggerated. She never raised her voice. She sounded sincere. That somehow made what came next even harder to hear. The Riverside Workshop property falls within Phase 2 of the redevelopment area. The room shifted. Parents exchanged uneasy glances. Someone near the back muttered, "Here we go." Audrey continued, "We understand this location has served the community for many years. Our team is committed to assisting relocation efforts." Grant felt Sophie's fingers tighten around his hand. She didn't say anything. She simply looked at her drawing tucked safely inside its folder. The floor opened for public questions. Several residents spoke first. Traffic. Parking. Construction noise. Then Grant stood. He didn't hurry to the microphone. He simply waited until it was his turn. "My name is Grant Holloway." Audrey's eyes lifted. Recognition flickered across her face almost instantly. Only for a second. No one else noticed. "I work for Columbus Transit Maintenance," Grant continued. "Every day I see how neighborhoods actually move." He pointed toward the projected transit map. Your presentation measures travel times. Audrey nodded. It does. It measures commuters. Correct. Grant looked around the room before speaking again. What about children who don't commute? Silence settled over the gym. What about grandparents who walk here every afternoon? He gestured toward Riverside Workshop. What about parents working double shifts who depend on this building because they can't afford private programs? No one interrupted him. They aren't traffic numbers, Grant said quietly. They're reasons. Audrey remained still. Malcolm Voss stepped toward the microphone. Our relocation strategy addresses those concerns. Grant turned toward him. Has anyone from your company spent an afternoon here? Malcolm hesitated. We've completed community assessments. That wasn't my question. Another silence. Longer this time. Grant wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. His voice stayed calm. Steady. The same voice that had spoken inside the coffee shop. Audrey looked at Malcolm. Then back toward Grant. For the first time since the meeting had begun, she ignored the prepared agenda lying on the podium. Instead, she looked directly at the people filling the room. And she began wondering whether the most important things about Riverside had never been measured at all. Real trust begins the moment someone realizes you cannot be bought. The morning after the community meeting, Audrey Whitmore canceled 3 investor calls. Her assistant looked genuinely alarmed. The Chicago partners have been waiting for 2 weeks. They can wait another day. The board won't like this. Audrey picked up the thick impact assessment from her desk. I'm not trying to make the board comfortable. Half an hour later, she arrived alone at the Columbus Municipal Transit Maintenance Center. No security detail. No executive convoy. Just the same black SUV parked quietly across the lot. Grant was replacing a suspension bracket beneath another electric bus when Rick walked over. Some woman in a business suit is asking for you. Grant slid out from under the vehicle, wiping his hands with an old towel. Then he saw her. For a brief moment, either of them spoke. Finally, Audrey smiled. I thought I'd introduce myself properly. You already did. Not really. She extended her hand. Audrey Whitmore. Grant shook. Grant Holloway. I owe you a thank you. You already said thank you? I'm talking about last week. You didn't owe me anything then either. She noticed the grease stains across his sleeves. The worn work boots. The aging pickup parked beyond the service bays. Nothing about him had changed since the coffee shop. That, somehow, made her trust him even more. I'd like to ask a favor, she said. Grant waited. I want someone outside my company to show me what my reports don't. He frowned slightly. I'm a mechanic. I know. You probably want an engineer. No. A consultant? No. Then why me? Because when everyone else was looking at projections, you asked about children. Grant glanced toward the buses lying beneath the steel roof. I'm not interested in consulting fees. I wasn't offering one. And if you were? I'd still ask. Grant thought quietly for several seconds. If I help, I don't work for you. I wouldn't ask you to. If I disagree with you, I'll say it. I expect you to. If the project deserves criticism, I'll criticize it. Audrey nodded. That's exactly why I'm here. Late that afternoon, they met outside Riverside Workshop. Children laughed from inside the building. Parents greeted Grant by name. Volunteers carried donated lumber through the front entrance. No one recognized Audrey. Without her tailored jacket, wearing a simple wool coat and jeans, she blended into the crowd more easily than anyone expected. Grant introduced her only as Audrey. Nothing more. Inside, retired electrician Carl Benson pointed toward shelves built 20 years earlier. We teach kids woodworking every Wednesday. Across the hall, Denise Holloway supervised an after-school reading group. Teenagers repaired donated bicycles. A young mother completed job applications while her son painted cardboard rockets. No one was paying tuition. No one asked who earned the most money. Everyone simply helped where they could. Audrey walked slowly through every room. No presentation slides. No attendance charts. Just ordinary lives unfolding in ordinary ways. Before leaving, Sophie quietly handed Audrey the folded transit map she had drawn. "You can borrow it," she said. Audrey carefully unfolded the page. Every bus line connected. Every neighborhood flowed toward Riverside Workshop. The building wasn't drawn as the largest place. It was drawn as the place where every route eventually crossed. Audrey stared at the map for a long moment. Then she looked toward the official transit diagrams inside the impact assessment resting in her briefcase. One showed efficiency. The other showed people. As the sun disappeared behind the old brick warehouses, Audrey finally understood something no executive report had ever taught her. The city wasn't organized by roads. It was organized by the lives that depended on where those roads led. Sometimes the smallest piece of evidence changes the largest decision. 2 mornings later, Audrey's office looked different. The polished conference table had disappeared beneath stacks of documents. Printed engineering reports sat beside handwritten notes from community volunteers. Architectural renderings rested next to children's drawings collected from Riverside Workshop. For the first time since the North Bank project had begun, both kinds of documents occupied equal space. Malcolm Voss entered carrying another binder. "I've updated the financial projections." Audrey looked up. "I asked for the original transit data. It's all included." "No." She slid the binder back toward him. "I asked for the raw files." Malcolm hesitated. "Our analysts already interpreted them. I don't want interpretations." She held his gaze. "I want the numbers before they became conclusions." An uncomfortable silence settled across the room. Finally Malcolm nodded. "I'll have IT send everything." That afternoon, Grant arrived with Sophie after school. They weren't there for another tour. They were there because Audrey had asked one question. Would Sophie explain her map? The conference room suddenly felt much larger than it had during the board meeting. Sophie's transit drawing rested across the polished table. Colored pencil lines crossed one another in dozens of directions. Tiny handwritten notes marked bus stops, walking paths, playgrounds, and after-school programs. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. To them, it looked like a child's artwork. Audrey said nothing. She simply looked at Sophie. "Can you show us?" The 10-year-old nodded. She pointed toward a blue line. "This is bus 12. Another line. "This is 21. Then another. "And this one only runs after school." Malcolm folded his arms politely. "They all stop nearby." Sophie shook her head. "They don't stop nearby." She tapped the center of the drawing. "They stop here." She circled Riverside Workshop. "If this building closes, kids have to switch buses." She traced another route. "Some of them have to cross here." Her finger rested on a busy intersection. Grant recognized it immediately. No pedestrian bridge. Heavy afternoon traffic. School buses. Delivery trucks. Sophie continued. "This one takes 23 more minutes." Another line. "This one stops running before woodworking class ends." Another. "This grandma has to walk 5 extra blocks." One executive frowned. "How do you know that?" Sophie answered honestly. "Because she told me." The room became quiet. Audrey opened the official transit model on the large screen. Then she compared it with Sophie's drawing. The engineering software measured average travel efficiency. Sophie's map measured actual human routines. Neither was technically wrong. But only one revealed what families would lose. Audrey looked toward Malcolm. "Was this intersection included in the pedestrian safety review?" He opened his laptop. "No." "What about after-school transfer times?" "No." "Evening bus frequency?" "Our transportation model used commuter averages." Grant spoke quietly. "Kids don't travel during rush hour averages." No one argued. Audrey stood and walked to the window overlooking downtown Columbus. For several moments she said nothing. Then she turned. "I want every assumption in the transportation study reviewed." Malcolm looked surprised. "That could delay construction for months." Then it delays. The investors won't accept that. They'll accept accurate information. And if the project costs more? Audrey answered without hesitation. Then we finally know its real price. As the meeting ended, Malcolm remained seated, his expression unreadable. He watched Sophie carefully roll up her transit map before placing it back inside its cardboard folder. To everyone else, it was still a child's drawing. To Malcolm, it had become something far more dangerous. It was evidence that the project's greatest weakness had not been found by engineers, economists, or consultants. It had been discovered by a 10-year-old girl who simply understood where people actually went when the school day ended. The past has a way of returning when the present is finally ready to understand it. 3 days before the board's final review, Columbus woke to a video that had quietly resurfaced overnight. It wasn't new. It had simply been forgotten. The live stream from Maple and Stone Coffee had been clipped and reposted by someone who recognized Audrey Whitmore after the community meeting. Millions of people now watched the same 90 seconds. The camera shook. The streamer laughed. Customers looked away. Then a transit mechanic carrying a lunchbox stepped into the frame. I don't have to know someone to know when they're asking to be left alone. The clip ended without applause. Without music. Without dramatic editing. Just an ordinary man returning to his coffee before leaving for work. That simplicity made it impossible to dismiss. By noon, every major business publication had picked up the story. Not because of Audrey. Because of Grant. Headlines called him humble. Heroic. Authentic. Grant ignored every one of them. At the maintenance center, his phone never stopped vibrating. Local reporters waited outside the entrance. Rick found him replacing brake components beneath bus 214. You planning to become famous? Grant slid the wrench into place. No. Too late. I still have buses to fix. Rick laughed. That's exactly why they're interested. Across town, Whitmore Urban Systems faced a different kind of attention. Board members questioned why their chief executive had visited Riverside Workshop without informing them. Investors worried the redevelopment timeline would slip. Malcolm Voss saw an opportunity. Inside the executive conference room, he placed several newspaper articles on the table. Public sentiment is becoming emotional. Audrey remained calm. Communities are emotional. We shouldn't make billion-dollar decisions because of viral videos. No. She folded one newspaper carefully. We should make them because the facts deserve to survive public attention. Malcolm leaned forward. The mechanic is influencing this project. No. Audrey answered evenly. The project is forcing us to ask better questions. Later that afternoon, Grant stopped by Riverside Workshop to help repair a broken workbench. Children surrounded him, asking about the video. He smiled awkwardly. It wasn't a big deal. Carl Benson shook his head. It became one. Grant tightened another bolt. I didn't do anything special. Carl looked around the workshop. Exactly. Those words stayed with Grant longer than he expected. As evening approached, Audrey arrived carrying a thin folder. No cameras followed her. She found Grant sanding rough edges from the repaired bench. I thought fame might have changed your schedule. It mostly changed my voicemail. She laughed softly. Then handed him the folder. Inside were copies of the original transportation datasets. Pages marked with handwritten notes. Highlighted inconsistencies. Missing pedestrian counts. Incorrect evening ridership assumptions. Several community facilities had been classified as optional destinations instead of essential services. Grant studied the pages. You found all this? We found it. She nodded toward the workshop. You started asking the questions. Before he could answer, Sophie ran into the room carrying her sketchbook. I drew something else. She showed Audrey a new picture. This time, Riverside Workshop remained at the center. But dozens of people stood around it, holding hands instead of bus maps. Grant smiled. What is it? Sophie looked at both adults before answering. It's what the city looks like when people protect each other. Audrey stared quietly at the drawing. The viral video had reminded millions of strangers that kindness still existed. The picture in Sophie's hands reminded her of something even more important. Kindness, when repeated often enough, eventually becomes the strongest kind of infrastructure a community can build. A city reveals its character not when everyone agrees, but when people decide what is worth protecting. The public hearing filled the Columbus City Hall chamber long before it officially began. Residents stood shoulder to shoulder along the back wall. Teachers, mechanics, business owners, parents holding restless children, retirees from Riverside Workshop. Across the aisle sat developers, investors, and representatives from Whitmore Urban Systems. No one expected an easy afternoon. Grant arrived quietly with Sophie. He wore the same clean work shirt he reserved for special occasions. Sophie carried nothing except the cardboard folder protecting her transit map. Audrey entered several minutes later. She greeted no cameras. Only a brief nod toward Grant before taking her seat. Malcolm Voss organized a stack of polished presentation boards beside the podium. Everything appeared perfectly prepared. The hearing began with routine formalities. Then Malcolm stepped forward. He spoke confidently about economic growth, construction jobs, tax revenue, housing demand. Digital renderings filled the projection screen. Glass buildings reflected sunlight that did not yet exist. Parks appeared where parking lots now stood. The audience listened politely. When Malcolm finished, applause came from only one section of the room. Then Audrey stood. Several board members looked surprised. She walked to the podium carrying neither presentation boards nor prepared remarks. Only a thin folder. "Our company came here to improve part of this city," she began. "But improvement requires understanding." She paused. "And we have discovered that our understanding was incomplete." A quiet murmur spread through the room. Audrey opened the folder. "Our transportation model omitted pedestrian safety around after-school travel." She turned another page. "It underestimated evening bus dependency." Another. "It classified community facilities according to economic output instead of daily necessity." Every sentence landed with careful precision. No excuses. No attempt to soften the mistakes. Only facts. Malcolm shifted uneasily. Several investors exchanged worried looks. Audrey continued. "I approved a review because people in this community asked better questions than our reports did." She stepped away from the podium. "I would like one of those people to speak." Grant froze. He hadn't expected this. The room slowly turned toward him. He walked forward without notes, without prepared remarks. He looked first at the council members, then at the families seated behind them. "I fix buses." A few people smiled. "I don't build billion-dollar projects." The room remained silent. "But every morning I watch who gets on those buses." He spoke calmly. "I know which grandparents carry groceries. I know which teenagers rush from school to part-time jobs. I know which parents work 2 shifts. He looked toward the architectural renderings still glowing on the screen. "A city isn't successful because it looks impressive from above." He turned toward the audience. "It's successful when ordinary people can reach the places that help them become extraordinary." No one interrupted. Grant nodded towards Sophie. She walked beside him and quietly unfolded her hand-drawn transit map across the council table. No speech. No explanation. Just colored lines connecting neighborhoods to Riverside Workshop. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One map measured movement. The other measured belonging. A council member leaned forward. "Miss Holloway, why is this building in the middle?" Sophie answered exactly as she had before. "Because that's where everyone meets." No one smiled. The simplicity carried too much truth. After several long moments, the council chair closed the public comment period. He looked across the crowded chamber. "I believe today's discussion has shown that infrastructure cannot be evaluated by cost alone." The hearing adjourned without a final vote. Outside City Hall, reporters rushed toward executives, council members, and community leaders. Grant quietly walked past every microphone. Audrey watched him disappear into the evening crowd with Sophie beside him. For the second time in her life, she saw him leave without asking for recognition. And for the second time, she realized that the strongest people were often the first to walk away once they had done what was right. The most meaningful victories are rarely the loudest. 2 weeks after the public hearing, the final decision arrived. The North Bank renewal project would continue, but not as originally planned. Riverside Workshop would remain exactly where it stood. The surrounding design would be rebuilt around it instead of replacing it. New pedestrian crossings were added. Evening bus service was expanded. Community facilities would now be measured as essential infrastructure rather than optional amenities. The announcement made national news. Many people called it a compromise. The families who depended on Riverside called it something else. Home. Inside Whitmore Urban Systems, another change quietly followed. Malcolm Voss submitted his resignation. No dramatic confrontation. No public humiliation. The investigation had shown that critical assumptions were omitted from the transportation analysis under his leadership. The board concluded that trust required accountability. Audrey accepted his resignation without celebration. Removing one executive would never matter as much as changing the system that allowed incomplete information to become accepted truth. Several months later, construction began. Not with demolition. With sidewalks. Bus shelters. Safer crossings. The first projects were the ones that helped people arrive before anything new was ever built. On a crisp Saturday morning in late October, Riverside Workshop hosted its annual neighborhood open house. Families filled every room. Carl supervised woodworking lessons. Denise's reading group overflowed into the hallway. Bicycles waited outside for repairs. Grant spent the morning replacing loose hinges on classroom cabinets. Exactly the sort of work no newspaper would ever cover. He preferred it that way. Sophie wandered through the building until Audrey found her standing in the entrance hall. Something new had appeared on the wall. Behind a simple wooden frame hung a familiar drawing. Not the updated picture with people holding hands. The original transit map. Every colored line. Every handwritten note. Every careful correction. A small brass plaque rested beneath it. It read, "Community is measured by the people who can reach one another." Contributed by Sophie Holloway. Sophie stared at the frame. They kept it. Audrey smiled. They needed a better map. Grant walked over quietly. He looked at the drawing for a long moment before looking at his daughter. "You know." He smiled. "You were right." Sophie tilted her head. "About what?" "The middle." She looked back at the map. "It was never about buses." Grant nodded. "No. It was about people." Audrey stepped toward the doorway where children laughed as they hurried between classrooms. "When I first came into that coffee shop," she said softly, "I thought someone had stood up for me." Grant looked out toward the parking lot where buses passed in the distance. "I didn't." She smiled, confused. "You stood up for something bigger." Grant considered that for a moment, then shook his head. "No." He looked first at Sophie, then around Riverside Workshop. "I just refused to sit down." Outside, another city bus slowed to a stop. Children climbed aboard after weekend classes. Parents waved goodbye. Neighbors greeted one another without hurry. Life continued exactly as it always had. Only now, the roads, the buses, and the future had learned to make room for the people who gave the city its meaning. Sometimes the greatest gift a father gives his child is not money, influence, or recognition. Sometimes it is one ordinary moment when he chooses kindness, never expecting anyone to remember it. And sometimes, that single choice becomes the reason an entire community is never forgotten.